Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is training fleas. You've probably heard of a flea circus. We're going to talk about how we have this upper limit of kind of a possibility that that we've been conditioned to, and we're going to talk about how to break through that and see where we go with it. So, but before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen just flooding your lungs and flowing into your bloodstream and nourishing all your cells and all your organs and bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And now let's, as you exhale any tension, any stress, negativity, or fatigue. And let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, your molecules, your electrons, and lighting you up from the inside out. And as you exhale any remaining stress, tension, negativity, fatigue. And now let's just gently press our palms together and softly, softly rub your fingers against your palms to feel how delicious that sensation is, and allow yourselves to become present to your physical form and all its deliciousness right here, right now. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning, Rosalind. So good to have you here with us. And welcome to everyone else who's joining us. We're talking today about training fleas. So I don't know if this is true or not true, but I heard this story about how you train fleas. So we're going to look at that and see how it applies to us. So the way that you train fleas, true or not true, at least it's a story, is that you put them in a jar, you put a lid on the jar, and the fleas jump and they hit the jar. They hit the lid of the jar. And after they hit the lid of the jar long enough, they learn where the lid of the jar is so that they jump not quite as high as the lid of the jar so that they don't hit it anymore. And then you can take off the lid of the jar and the fleas will only jump as high as the jar. So there's a lesson in this for us, in that we get conditioned to possibility or a limit of possibility, right? We get conditioned to a certain capacity, for instance, for love, or a certain capacity for success. So maybe we're tootling along really, really well and being very productive and satisfied and moving right along. And then all of a sudden, we get to a place where maybe we're out of our comfort zone, or we're approaching the place where we're out of our comfort zone. And all of a sudden, boom, self-sabotage pops up. And what's up with that? Good morning, Andrea. So good to have you here with us. We're talking today about training fleas. In other words, we're talking about how we get conditioned to our limitations, not to our limitations, but we adopt limitations. So maybe limitations in success. For instance, with money, maybe we have some issues around money, and perhaps we get to a certain point where we have a certain amount of savings or prosperity, and then bam, we manifest all kinds of expenses that would have been otherwise unanticipated. We put ourselves back into debt, for instance. Like get out of debt, get clean and clear of it, and then bam, right back in as soon as we've cleared it, because there are other issues. We've reached the jar, lid, and our tolerance for different degrees of fulfillment, joy, happiness. It's a fascinating dynamic where we bring about our own demise in these situations, to bring us back into the kind of situation that we had been trying to emerge from. And it may be there's a level of comfort, like we may be conditioned to, for instance, if we have the notion that I'm a failure, for example, and then I start achieving all kinds of success, what might happen is that I will then do something to sabotage my success. So as an example, there was a guy who was a personal transformation, growth and transformation, self-styled guru kind of person. Not like spiritual guru, but like a motivational speaker, but transformational kinds of programs and such. And it was very interesting because he, in his conversation, talked about how he had this pattern in the past of, reaching a certain degree of success, and then he would self-sabotage in some way or another. And here he was on the stage telling us about this pattern that he had. And he was gaining tremendous visibility and fame, really, popularity. And what happened was that he had a transformational group get together, and they had a sweat lodge. And what happened was tragic. 3 people died in this, or as a result of this event. And the way that it was handled, the way that he handled it, was he slunk away, like left the scene, and ended up spending some time in jail for involuntary manslaughter, I think. And so it was a devastating fall from this pinnacle of success. And it's interesting because this was a situation where he had been clearly working on this pattern that he had. I mean, he did it in a very grand way, unfortunately. But he had been working on clearing this pattern, and he was very aware of it. And yet he still manifested situations that perpetuated the pattern. And so the question is, what is the upper limit of our capacity? Where is the lid on our jar that has kept us entrained to a certain level or a certain range of experience, a certain level of possibility, a certain limit of possibility? And I wonder, I think that we can look at our lives and see patterns that we've been working to transcend and heal. And it takes work, right? What the path of awareness and healing, as we've said so many times together, is not for the faint of heart. It requires deep self-searching. and finding the path to true self-acceptance, and forgiveness. And then what happens? How do we move beyond these patterns? I think it's I wish I had an ABC kind of recipe, because I don't think that we can reduce it to something that simple. If we are tuned to a particular frequency, like the station on a radio, for example, then we don't really know that there are other frequencies, right? We don't necessarily know how to self-tune to access these other frequencies of experience. And I tend to believe that all of this stuff, well, it's not really that big a stretch. We're energy, right? Everything is energy. Just look at physics and it'll confirm that, right? Good morning, Josie. Welcome. We're talking about training fleas, with the fleas being us, and the idea about training fleas. Hi, Bernadette. Welcome. It's great to have you here. The idea about training fleas, if you missed it, is that, and hi, Dennis. Welcome. Is that you put the fleas in a jar, you put a lid on the jar, the fleas jump, they hit the lid, and eventually they learn that if they jump not quite as high, that they won't hit the lid. And when that happens, you can take off the lid and the fleas will just stay in the jar. And like I said, I don't know if this is true or not true, but in any case, I think that it is a beautiful metaphor for how we operate in life. And I have to say, I'll give credit where credit's due, that that came from what years ago used to be called the EST training, and now is landmark education. But it's personal growth and development transformation platform. And anyway, so we're talking about how do we transcend that upper limit? Like, how do we take the lid off and actually get out of the jar, essentially? And I think maybe the first step might be to recognize that the lid isn't there. Because at first, when we're being trained into it, by what we're raised with, we were talking about the pain of family indoctrination and being the grown-up yesterday. We're talking. So today, if we look at like the lid, maybe we've been told that we're not good enough. Maybe we've been told that, well, you'll never amount to anything, or you're just a dreamer, or you never follow through, or all these things that we're programmed to in our lives. If we can start recognizing that was the lid, and so we started jumping not quite as high as the lid, and then as adults we get to recognize that. And maybe we don't have to wait till we're adults. Wouldn't that be amazing to have kids recognizing that the lid isn't there either? That in fact, maybe the jar's not even there, or if it is, it's not something we can't get out of. So what does it look like to be recognizing that the limits that were imposed upon us, we then began to impose upon ourselves, like the fleas did, right? I have an example. Like when I was growing up, our family was pretty fraught. At least that was my experience of it, and that's all I can speak to is, like my experience of it, which was very traumatic. And I felt, I felt inadequate. like that was something that was, I received as my indoctrination. And I'll speak it that way because at this point, who knows what was real and what wasn't real. But what I do know is that I felt a lot of self-hatred and a lot of guilt and a lot of shame and a lot of all kinds of other negative feelings. Anyway, when I went away to school, I believed that it was my family, right? With the harsh language and when I went to school, my family wasn't there. And what I realized is I was playing the role by adopting that harsh language for myself. And that I just continued training myself as the flea. I was holding the lid on the jar really, really tightly. And it took a long time, a lot of years to figure out that there was no lid. And maybe I'm still figuring out on certain levels. I think, this is an evolutionary process. Bernadette says, we stand shoulder to shoulder and support each other. The positive energy train, it can break through mountains. I love that, Bernadette. What an awesome, awesome visual. And the positive energy train, I'm just sort of seeing us all standing there shoulder to shoulder, emanating light, and creating this brilliant, brilliant, bright light that is able to burn through the darkness, for sure. I love that, Bernadette. So again, looking at limitations, our limitations are self-imposed. So you might dispute that. And what comes to mind is this woman, and I don't know her name, and I don't know how to have you find her, but she was born with no legs. And I believe she was adopted because her birth family just didn't know how to cope with her. And she was adopted, I believe, she was adopted by a family that lived with no limits. And this woman became an athlete. She became a gymnast of all things, and a competing gymnast and a prize-winning gymnast. And freaking remarkable, right? Because anybody in their quote unquote right mind would say that's a total impossibility. But this woman and the family that let her understand there were no limits, just blew the jar out of the water, right? There was no jar, let alone a lid, to be doing the impossible. And I think we talked about logic and rationality last week, and like it's completely irrational and to imagine that someone who had no legs could be a prize-winning gymnast, right? And so this is why we get to live beyond logic and beyond reason, because that certainly wasn't in any way reasonable, right? And when we recognize like the limits that we impose upon ourselves. They may have been imposed upon us, but we then accept them the same way that the fleas accepted the lid on the jar. And what we get to do is to start, I think the way to recognize that there's no lid on the jar, or to take off the lid that we've put on the jar, is to start recognizing the limits that we've defined for ourselves. For instance, people who might be dreaming of or saying, I wish I had been an architect. I should have been an architect. I lost the opportunity. I'm too old now. It's too late now. And the thing is, it's not. you can go back to school at any age, right? Or I wanted to be a painter, but I can't be a painter because I'll never be a world famous painter. Well, that's nuts. Painting isn't about being world famous. Painting is about painting. Painting is about the creative expression, right? It's about the experience of it, not the outcome, not the and along that line, I was speaking with the same client who brought up this conversation that ended up talking about training fleas. It was a book, I think it's called The Leap or something like that, that talks about this upper limit. I haven't read the book yet, so I can't credit it. But anyway, this person is tremendously creative and is doing things, beautiful, beautiful things with ceramics. And what we recognized is that every time they make something, they start thinking about, well, is it practical, and how can I sell it, and how can I make it productive? And what we got to is the creative process is what the objective is. The experience of that creative process is itself the objective, and not the thing in the outcome. And what we came up with is that they could make some of these wonderful pieces and smash them. Smash them, collapse them, whatever, because to be able to move away from the attachment to what can I make this, how can I monetize this, for example, and having the monetization be the value of it, rather than have the creative process itself be the value. And when the creative process is the value, then all these wonderful manifestations may or may not turn into something that is monetizable, but it's not motivated by that intention. It's motivated by the intention of the pure expression and the experience. And I think that that's what we need to be putting our attention to when we have pure motivation in creation. That's when miracles happen. That's when magic gets made. That's when art evolves. So Bernadette says, just like the motivational speaker who was born with no limbs and became extremely successful, he's inspiring. Exactly, Bernadette. There are so many people who have been who have transcended what might look like obvious, with big air quotes, limitations. Like there are people who are fully functional, healthy, intelligent, attractive, like all these things that we value, that we think are the highest values, right? Who end up doing nothing, who end up being sad and depressed and despairing, when it looks like they have every opportunity and every possibility, and a loaf of bread under each arm kind of thing. And other people who have experienced tremendous obstacles and challenges, who rise way beyond any rational prediction. And what is it that makes that difference? It's whether or not we accept the lid on the jar. It's whether or not we allow ourselves to stretch beyond our perceived boundaries, our perceived limitations. And ultimately, what it comes down to is that it is truly our perception and our projection, whether we're projecting it on those limitations onto ourselves or onto others. So Maggie's bowing. Oh, I have unfolding piece of information about the Maggie story for those of you who were aware that on July 18th, which was my birthday, she flew away. And I was bereft here online also, and for 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, well, Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday actually. And then I got a call from the SPCA that they had her. I had posted some things online. Well, last night, and this is still an emerging story, but talk about miracles propagating miracles, right? Last night, I saw an email from someone on one of the lists that I had I only posted on like 2 or 3 lists, but from one of the lists that I posted on, saying that she knew the people who found Maggie. And would I be interested in learning about what happened and their experience with her? And so we're in the process of trying to connect. But how cool is that? That because I had asked the SPCA to put me in touch with the people who found her, and apparently these people who found her had asked the SPCA to put them in touch with me, but it never happened. And so I left a message last night expressing how grateful I was that they had brought Maggie back, or made it possible for me to get Maggie back. And so yet to be continued, talking about miracles and the limits of imagination and rationality, right? So who'd have thunk it? Anyway, Rosalind says, good bow, Maggie. Would love to hear more about Maggie's journey back home. Me too, me too. Bernadette says, how exciting. I can't wait to find out. And I guess we get to, I've been talking about starting a Pinterest page for Maggie, because I have this wonderful teacher for Pinterest. And so Maggie's going to have a Pinterest page, but we'll have to put her adventure on it. We're going to have musings from Maggie, I think, on her Pinterest. Good bow, Maggie. Big bow. Big bow. Good girl. Good girl, Maggie. Big bow. She's very proud of herself. Anyway, that's it for this morning. Let's not be fleas. Let's take the lid off the jar and live into our greater and greatest possibility. So that's it for this morning. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live each weekday morning here on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page. Please check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network on the Facebook page, as well as EWN One with the Earth and Enlightened World Living. And until next time, so much love.